The story of Poland in the Second World War does not begin in September 1939, but in the geopolitical crises that preceded it. The Polish state, re-established in 1918 after 123 years of partitions, occupied a territory of 38,900 square kilometers with a population of about 35 million people. Its geography placed it between two rising powers with expansionist agendas, Nazi Germany in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. Both regarded Poland's independence as an obstacle to their long-term strategic aims. For Germany, Adolf Hitler's foreign policy sought not only the revision of the Treaty of Versailles, but also territorial expansion to secure Lebensraum. For the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin maintained ambitions to recover lands lost after the First World War, and to expand communist influence westward. Poland's foreign policy during the interwar period attempted to balance between these powers. Non-aggression pacts were signed with both Germany in 1934 and the Soviet Union in 1932, but neither agreement guaranteed real security. By the mid-1930s, Poland had aligned itself more closely with France and Britain, signing mutual assistance agreements that were intended to deter aggression. However, the effectiveness of these alliances was questionable, as the Western powers had limited means of projecting military support into Eastern Europe without cooperation from other states. Militarily, the Second Polish Republic fielded a substantial force on paper. About 1.3 million men could be mobilized, supported by around 4,300 artillery pieces, 430 tanks, and approximately 400 modern aircraft. Yet these figures masked critical weaknesses. Much of the equipment was outdated, the armored force was dispersed in small units, and the Air Force lagged behind the Luftwaffe in both numbers and technology. German forces in 1939 could deploy more than 60 divisions, including 6 panzer divisions with nearly 2,800 tanks, and about 2,000 combat aircraft. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had over 2,000 tanks and around 1,000 aircraft available across its vast territory, although much of this equipment was concentrated further east. Public sentiment in Poland reflected a mixture of determination and apprehension. Memories of the successful defense against the Soviet invasion of 1920 fostered confidence in national resilience. Yet the experience of the Great Depression and ongoing political instability under the Sinatra regime had weakened state institutions. Ethnic diversity added further complexity. About 1/3 of the population were minorities, including Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, and Germans, many of whom held ambivalent or conflicting loyalties in the event of war. Internationally, the Munich Agreement of 1938 provided a decisive lesson for Warsaw. The Western powers' acquiescence to Germany's annexation of Czechoslovakia demonstrated that collective security guarantees might prove unreliable. Poland itself had opportunistically seized Zaolzie from Czechoslovakia during the crisis, a move that worsened its diplomatic standing and left it more isolated. By early 1939, the prospect of German demands on Poland, particularly concerning the free city of Danzig and extraterritorial rights through the Polish corridor, became increasingly likely. Negotiations failed to reconcile these disputes, and Hitler began preparing for a military solution. The Soviet Union's position evolved in parallel. Having been excluded from Western negotiations at Munich, Stalin viewed both Britain and France with suspicion. Moscow explored possible security arrangements, but also entered into secret talks with Berlin. The result was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 23 August 1939, which included a secret protocol dividing Poland and the Baltic states into spheres of influence. This agreement ensured that Germany would face no Soviet opposition to its planned invasion. As September approached, Poland faced a strategic dilemma. Its leadership believed that war with Germany was imminent, but expected that French and British offensives in the West would relieve pressure within weeks. Intelligence assessments underestimated the speed and coordination of the German Blitzkrieg doctrine, while overestimating the ability of Poland's fortifications and reserves to delay an attack. Mobilization was incomplete by the time hostilities began, partly due to Western advice not to provoke Germany prematurely. The Polish defensive plan, known as Plan West, committed troops to a forward defense along the borders to protect industrial regions and urban centers. This decision left units vulnerable to encirclement and reduced the possibility of retreating to more defensible lines. Nonetheless, Polish commanders hoped that by holding out for 2 to 3 months, external support from France and Britain would force Germany into a two-front war. Civil defense preparations were minimal, as authorities sought to maintain public order and avoid panic, while underground networks of political and military activists began quietly considering contingency plans should the state collapse. By the eve of 1 September 1939, the stage was set for Poland to become the first victim of a coordinated German-Soviet strategy. The decisions taken during the interwar decades, the balance of military forces, and the complex web of alliances and mistrust would determine how Poland would face the catastrophe that followed. At dawn on 1 September 1939, German forces launched their assault on Poland across multiple fronts. Approximately 1.5 million German soldiers advanced with the support of 2,800 tanks and over 2,000 aircraft. The opening attack began with the Luftwaffe targeting Polish airfields, communication centers, and rail hubs. Within the first hours, waves of bombers struck Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow, and other key cities, aiming to paralyze command structures and civilian morale. The Kriegsmarine joined in, with the battleship Schleswig-Holstein shelling the Polish garrison at Westerplatte near Danzig, an action often regarded as the symbolic beginning of the conflict. Polish forces, numbering about 95,000 mobilized by the first week of September, attempted to execute Plan West. Along the northern sector, Army Pomorze was tasked with defending the Polish corridor, while Army Modlin protected the approaches to Warsaw. In the center, Army Łódź and Army Poznan guarded the industrial heartland. To the south, Army Krakow faced the German thrust through Upper Silesia and Slovakia, while Army Karpaty was responsible for defending the Carpathian passes. Each of these groupings faced concentrated German attacks, supported by rapid mechanized advances. The Luftwaffe's early superiority proved decisive. Within days, the majority of Poland's 400 combat-ready aircraft had been destroyed or forced to operate from improvised airstrips. Though Polish pilots managed to down an estimated 120 German aircraft in the first week, the scale of attrition made sustained resistance impossible. On the ground, German panzer divisions advanced at speeds rarely seen in previous wars. Coordinated by radio communication and supported by close air support from Stuka dive bombers, armored spearheads bypassed strongpoints, encircled Polish formations, and disrupted mobilization. One of the earliest major battles occurred near the town of Mokra on 1 September, where the Wawinska Cavalry Brigade engaged the 4th Panzer Division. Contrary to later myths, Polish cavalry did not charge tanks with sabers, but fought using anti-tank rifles and field artillery. The brigade inflicted losses on German armor. Around 80 vehicles were damaged or destroyed, yet was eventually forced to retreat under pressure. This encounter demonstrated both the determination of Polish defenders and the vulnerability of forward-positioned units to coordinated mechanized assault. Civilian populations experienced immediate disruption. Refugees clogged roads as German columns advanced, complicating Polish troop movements. Luftwaffe strafing of these columns contributed to panic and hampered efforts to redeploy forces. German propaganda presented the campaign as a defensive necessity, emphasizing alleged Polish provocations in Danzig and along the border. Meanwhile, Polish radio broadcasts appealed for unity and highlighted instances of local resistance, even as government ministries began preparations to evacuate eastward. Strategically, German High Command pursued a double envelopment of Polish forces. Army Group North, under General Fedor von Bock, pushed south from East Prussia and west from Pomerania, while Army Group South, commanded by General Gerd von Rundstedt, struck northward from Silesia and Slovakia. The intention was to converge on Warsaw and encircle Polish armies west of the Vistula River. Polish commanders, recognizing the danger, ordered counterattacks where possible. General Tadeusz Kutzeba's Army Poznan remained relatively unengaged in the first days, positioned to potentially strike at exposed German flanks. International reactions were swift but limited in practical effect. On 3rd September, Britain and France declared war on Germany in accordance with their commitments to Poland. However, their military actions were restricted to minor skirmishes along the German-French border, known as the Saar Offensive, involving around 11 French divisions advancing a few kilometers before halting. For Poland, the lack of substantial Western pressure on Germany meant that the burden of defense remained almost entirely domestic. By the first week of September, German forces had penetrated deep into Polish territory. Łódź fell on 8th September, and armored units reached the outskirts of Warsaw the following day. Despite the rapid advance, Polish resistance was not entirely broken. Local counterattacks inflicted losses, and Polish units continued to retreat in an organized fashion toward the Vistula and the Romanian bridgehead in the southeast, where they hoped to establish a defensive line and maintain contact with Allied supply routes. The initial phase of the campaign revealed the asymmetry of military power between Germany and Poland. While Polish troops demonstrated determination and tactical skill in isolated battles, the speed, coordination, and firepower of the German assault undermined the viability of the forward defense strategy. The stage was set for larger encirclements, the siege of Warsaw, and, eventually, the intervention of the Soviet Union from the east, which would transform Poland's predicament from a conventional war into a struggle for national survival under dual occupation. The German advance in the second week of September 1939 began to reveal the deeper strategic intentions behind the campaign. Army Group North pressed toward Warsaw from East Prussia, while Army Group South drove northward from Silesia and Slovakia. The result was a tightening pincer aimed at surrounding the bulk of the Polish armies west of the Vistula River. At the same time, the Luftwaffe intensified its bombardments, striking bridges, rail junctions, and communication lines to prevent Polish regrouping. The disruption of transport networks forced many units to march on foot, losing cohesion and time as German mechanized columns advanced unhindered along major roads. One of the most significant counteroffensives attempted by the Polish command took place in the Battle of Bzura, beginning on 9th September. General Tadeusz Kutrzeba, commanding Army Poznan, and General Władysław Bortnowski of Army Pomorze launched an attack against the German 8th Army near the Bzura River, west of Warsaw. Initially, the offensive achieved surprise. Polish forces, numbering around 15,000 men with artillery and cavalry support, pushed the German front back and inflicted losses on the 30th and 24th Infantry Divisions. For several days, German units were forced onto the defensive, and the counterattack relieved pressure on Warsaw by diverting German resources. However, the lack of air superiority and mechanized reserves meant that the Polish momentum quickly stalled. The Luftwaffe responded with concentrated bombing runs, and by mid-September, German reinforcements, including panzer divisions, encircled the Polish attackers. The counteroffensive ended with heavy losses, around 17,000 killed and 12,000 taken prisoner, though it delayed the German timetable by nearly a week. Elsewhere, Polish forces conducted delaying actions across multiple fronts. At Wisna, a small garrison of 720 soldiers and 20 machine guns, under Captain Władysław Reginis, held positions along bunkers and trenches against the 10th Army, including 2 panzer divisions numbering over 4,000 men with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. The battle lasted from 7 to 10th September, ending in the destruction of the Polish defenders, but the resistance tied down German forces during critical days of the advance. Similarly, in the south, the Polish 10th Motorized Cavalry Brigade, under Colonel Stanisław Maciek, conducted mobile defensive operations against German and Slovak units, retreating eastward while inflicting losses and maintaining unit cohesion. The civilian population bore the brunt of the campaign. By the second week, refugee columns stretched for kilometers, with estimates suggesting several million Poles were displaced within days. German aircraft repeatedly targeted these movements, complicating military logistics and spreading panic. In Warsaw, the government began to evacuate ministries to Lublin, while foreign embassies prepared contingency plans. Propaganda battles intensified. German broadcasts portrayed the conflict as a justified response to alleged Polish provocations, while Polish radio emphasized resilience and sought to maintain national unity despite mounting losses. International diplomacy during this phase highlighted Poland's growing isolation. Although Britain and France were formally at war with Germany, their military commitments remained minimal. The French Saar offensive was halted after limited advances, and the British Expeditionary Force was still mobilizing in France. Polish leaders continued to hope for a decisive Allied intervention, but recognized the growing danger posed by the Soviet Union, which remained neutral under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Reports circulated in Warsaw about potential Soviet actions, but no clear strategy was available to counter the possibility of a second invasion. German command structures benefited from superior coordination. Rundstedt's Army Group South included 35 divisions, among them 5 panzer divisions and 4 motorized divisions, supported by Luftflotte, 4 under General Alexander Luhr. Bach's Army Group North fielded 25 divisions, including 1 Panzer and 1 motorized corps, supported by Luftflotte 1 under General Albert Kesselring. In contrast, Polish units were scattered and often operating without reliable communication with headquarters. This disparity in operational control contributed significantly to the rapid German gains. By mid-September, German forces had reached the outskirts of Warsaw and began preparations for a siege. The capital, with a pre-war population of about 1.3 million, faced shortages of food, water, and medical supplies as bombing raids continued daily. The Polish army attempted to regroup in the southeast around the so-called Romanian bridgehead, a region near the Romanian border considered a fallback zone for continuing resistance and potential resupply from Allied partners. Several armies, including what remained of Army Krakow and Army Karpaty, began retreating toward this area in hopes of maintaining organized defense. The campaign's second week demonstrated both the resilience and limitations of Polish resistance. Local successes, such as at the Bzura and in delaying actions across the front, slowed the German advance but could not reverse the overall balance of power. The disparity in mobility, firepower, and air dominance remained decisive. While German planners anticipated rapid victory, they encountered pockets of determined opposition that temporarily disrupted timetables. Yet, the overall trajectory of the campaign pointed toward encirclement and collapse, with Poland's strategic options narrowing as the specter of Soviet intervention grew increasingly likely. By the middle of September 1939, the Polish campaign entered a critical phase. German forces had advanced on all fronts, and the encirclement of large Polish formations became the central focus of operations. The fall of key cities, the collapse of organized lines, and the increasing involvement of civilians in the war effort marked this stage as a turning point where survival rather than defense became the primary objective for many Polish units. The campaign also shifted from mobile battles to sieges and encirclements, placing immense strain on both the army and the civilian population. Warsaw quickly became the symbolic and practical center of resistance. German units of the 4th Panzer Division reached the western outskirts of the capital by 8 September, initiating probing attacks. Initial attempts to storm the city were repelled by defenders, including regular troops, police, and volunteers hastily armed from stockpiles. The German command decided to postpone direct assaults and instead prepare for systematic encirclement and bombardment. Luftwaffe raids grew in intensity, targeting waterworks, bridges, and residential districts. By 13 September, artillery bombardments joined the air attacks, creating widespread destruction. Casualty figures rose steadily. By mid-month, several thousand civilians had been killed, and essential services were severely disrupted. Beyond Warsaw, the German encirclement strategy focused on eliminating Polish armies still maneuvering in the field. The Battle of the Bzura, which had offered hope of a counterstroke, ended with the near-total destruction of Army Poznan and Army Pomors. Between 14 and 18 September, remnants attempted to break through to Warsaw, but German armored divisions and continuous air attacks cut off retreat paths. Approximately 12,000 Polish soldiers were captured, one of the largest single losses of the campaign. This defeat removed a major field force from the Polish order of battle and left the capital increasingly isolated. In the eastern and southern sectors, Polish forces carried out difficult withdrawals toward the Romanian bridgehead. This area, bordered by Romania and Hungary, had been designated as a defensive fallback zone, where the Polish army could regroup, receive supplies from Western allies, and potentially continue resistance. Several armies, including Army Krakow and Army Carpaty, managed partial retreats but faced constant harassment from advancing German units. Motorized formations from Rundstedt's Army Group South moved faster than the retreating infantry, repeatedly cutting off columns and forcing engagements. Losses mounted, and supply shortages worsened. German propaganda emphasized the inevitability of victory. Radio broadcasts announced daily advances and large prisoner captures, while newspapers in Berlin portrayed the campaign as nearly concluded. At the same time, German authorities sought to reassure populations in annexed areas that order would be restored under new administration. In contrast, Polish broadcasts from Warsaw and Lwów stressed continued resistance and appealed to the Western Allies for imminent relief. These conflicting narratives reflected the widening gap between expectations and the reality facing Polish soldiers and civilians. The international dimension became increasingly complex. Britain and France had formally declared war on the 3rd September, but their actions remained minimal. The French Saar offensive, which briefly advanced several kilometers into German territory with around 30 divisions, was halted on 12th of September by orders from the French High Command, which judged the operation unsustainable. Britain continued its naval blockade strategy, but did not engage in large-scale land operations. For Poland, the absence of meaningful Western pressure on Germany confirmed the isolation of its battlefield. The Soviet Union's role loomed large in Polish calculations. Intelligence reports and diplomatic warnings suggested that Red Army movements near the eastern frontier had intensified. Polish leaders, including Marshal Edward Śmigły-Rydz, debated the possibility of withdrawing government institutions and remaining forces into Romania if the eastern frontier was violated. Yet official communications to the population avoided acknowledging this risk, focusing instead on encouraging endurance in the face of the German assault. Urban populations endured increasingly severe conditions. In Warsaw, daily air raids forced thousands into makeshift shelters in basements and tunnels. Food shortages led to rationing, while medical facilities struggled to cope with casualties. In other cities, such as Lwów and Przemyśl, civilians joined in constructing barricades and defensive works, anticipating direct attacks. Refugee flows continued to strain the countryside, with villages hosting displaced persons far beyond their capacity. By 16th of September, German armored spearheads had crossed the Bug and San rivers, reaching deep into southeastern Poland. The rapid advance threatened to cut off routes to Romania and Hungary, limiting the viability of the planned fallback zone. Command cohesion further deteriorated as many headquarters lost contact with subordinate units. Communications were increasingly reliant on couriers rather than functioning radio networks, slowing decision-making and coordination. The campaign's fourth stage demonstrated the collapse of Poland's initial defensive strategy and the growing inevitability of a national catastrophe. While individual units fought determined rearguard actions, the disparity in mobility, firepower, and coordination left few options. With Warsaw under siege, the Bzura counteroffensive crushed, and retreat paths narrowing in the southeast, Poland's strategic position depended not only on its own remaining strength, but also on the uncertain actions of the Soviet Union. The entry of a second great power into the campaign was imminent, and it would transform the nature of the conflict from a conventional war of invasion into a dual occupation with long-lasting consequences. On the 17th of September 1939, the strategic landscape of the Polish campaign was irreversibly altered. In accordance with the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union launched its invasion of eastern Poland. Approximately 46,000 Red Army troops, organized into two fronts, the Ukrainian front under General Semyon Timoshenko and the Belarusian front under General Mikhail Kovalyov, crossed the Polish border along a front of more than 1,400 kilometers. Their forces included around 4,700 tanks and 3,300 aircraft, vastly outnumbering the scattered and exhausted Polish units remaining in the east. The official justification presented by Moscow was that the Polish state had ceased to exist, and that the Soviet Union was intervening to protect Ukrainians and Belarusians living in Polish territory. In practice, the invasion was a coordinated implementation of the agreement with Nazi Germany to divide the country. For Polish leaders, the Soviet action eliminated the last strategic option of retreating to the Romanian bridgehead. Marshal Edward WWII issued an order instructing units not to engage the Soviets unless attacked, and to attempt withdrawal into Romania or Hungary to avoid encirclement. On the ground, this policy created confusion. Some Polish units surrendered to the Red Army without resistance, while others engaged in scattered fighting. In Grodno, Polish defenders, including regular troops and local volunteers, resisted Soviet armored forces from 20 to 22 September, destroying several dozen tanks before being overwhelmed. Casualties included both military personnel and civilians, as Soviet troops retaliated against those who had resisted. In other areas, such as Volhynia and eastern Galicia, Polish units attempted rapid withdrawals southward, often colliding with advancing Soviet columns. The dual invasion from west and east left no possibility of maintaining organized resistance. Warsaw remained under siege during this period. By 18th September, German artillery and air bombardments had intensified, with incendiary raids destroying entire districts. Civilian casualties continued to climb, reaching tens of thousands. The city's defenders included remnants of several Polish armies, police, fire brigades, and armed civilians, amounting to around 12,000 men. Despite shortages of ammunition and food, they continued to resist. German commanders initially demanded unconditional surrender, but Polish authorities refused. The siege tied down significant German forces, even as Soviet entry into the conflict assured overall Axis success. In the southeast, the city of Lwów became another focal point of the campaign. German forces began assaulting the city on 12th September, but by 18th September, Soviet units arrived from the east. After negotiations, Lwow's defenders surrendered to the Red Army on 22nd September, preferring Soviet captivity to German occupation. This pattern repeated across eastern Poland, where many Polish troops sought surrender to Soviet forces under the assumption of better treatment, though the long-term consequences would prove severe. The fate of Polish leadership reflected the collapse of the state. On 17th September, the Polish government crossed into Romania, where they were interned. President Ignacy Mościcki, Prime Minister Felicjan Sławoj-Składkowski, and Marshal WWII all entered exile, effectively leaving the country without central command. The Polish political leadership later reconstituted itself in France as a government in exile, but within Poland, authority shifted toward underground networks and local commanders improvising survival strategies. German and Soviet forces met on 22 September in Brest-Litovsk, staging a joint parade to mark the handover of occupied zones. The subsequent German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty of 28 September confirmed the division of Poland along the Bug River, with Germany taking western and central regions and the Soviet Union annexing eastern territories. This division transferred roughly 8,000 square kilometers and 13 million inhabitants into Soviet control, while Germany incorporated around 2,000 square kilometers with 22 million inhabitants. The dual occupation initiated immediate changes in governance and security. In German-held areas, the western provinces, including Poznan and Upper Silesia, were annexed directly into the Reich, while central Poland was organized as the general government under Hans Frank. Policies of Germanization, forced labor, and repression of elites began swiftly. In the Soviet zone, eastern territories were annexed into the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet republics. Soviet authorities carried out mass arrests of Polish officials, landowners, and military officers while promoting local communist organizations. Between September 1939 and mid-1941, hundreds of thousands of Poles were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. For Polish soldiers, the campaign concluded with catastrophic losses. Approximately 66,000 were killed, 33,000 wounded, and around 4,000 taken prisoner by Germany. the Soviets captured an additional 24,000 troops. Despite these figures, nearly 8,000 soldiers managed to escape through Romania, Hungary, and Lithuania, forming the nucleus of future Polish armed forces in exile. Civilian losses were equally severe. The destruction of Warsaw left nearly 10% of its buildings in ruins. Refugee crises spread across the country, with millions displaced. The combined invasions marked not only the end of the September campaign, but also the beginning of a prolonged occupation by two powers whose policies toward the Polish population would diverge in form, but converge in their consequences of repression and loss of sovereignty. By the close of September 1939, the Polish state ceased to exist as an independent entity. Yet the foundations of resistance were already forming. In the ruins of Warsaw, and in the networks of officers and politicians who avoided capture, the early outlines of an underground movement began to appear. What followed was not the disappearance of Poland, but its transformation into one of the most extensive resistance states in occupied Europe, laying the groundwork for the Polish underground state and its armed wing, the Home Army, in the years to come. The collapse of the Polish state in September 1939 did not end organized Polish activity. Instead, it marked the beginning of a transformation from conventional defense to clandestine resistance. Even before the surrender of Warsaw, on 28 September, efforts were underway to create underground structures capable of continuing the struggle. On 27 September, in besieged Warsaw, surviving military and political leaders established the Service for Poland's Victory, Służba Zwycięstwa Polski SZB, which became the nucleus of an organized underground state. This initiative sought to unify disparate groups, maintain contact with the government in exile, and prepare for a long occupation under both German and Soviet rule. The underground faced immense challenges from the outset. German authorities in the general government began a systematic campaign to eliminate potential centers of resistance. Operation AB, Außerordentliche Befriedungsaktion, targeted intellectuals, teachers, clergy, and former officers, leading to mass arrests and executions. In the Soviet-occupied territories, NKVD units arrested tens of thousands of Polish officials and members of the intelligentsia. The Cotton Massacre of spring 1940, in which over 21,000 Polish officers and intellectuals were executed, was one consequence of this policy. Both occupiers sought to prevent any organized Polish leadership from emerging. Despite this repression, underground networks expanded rapidly. In November 1939, General Władysław Sikorski, heading the Polish government in exile in France, recognized the SZP as the foundation of the resistance and reorganized it into the Union of Armed Struggle, Związek Walki Zbrojnej, ZWZ. This marked a decisive step in linking underground military structures in occupied Poland with the exiled leadership. Command was divided geographically. General Kazimierz Zozinkowski oversaw operations from abroad, while inside occupied Poland, two main commanders operated, General Stefan Rowecki, Groth, in the German zone, and General Majko Karaszewicz Tokarzewski in the Soviet zone. The goals of the ZWZ were ambitious yet carefully planned. It aimed to build a nationwide network of cells, maintain secrecy through compartmentalization, and prepare for a future uprising coordinated with Allied offensives. Members engaged in intelligence gathering, sabotage, and clandestine publishing. Reports sent to London included detailed information on German troop movements, industrial production, and the use of occupied Poland for logistical operations. Polish intelligence became one of the most valuable sources for the Allies, providing early data on German rocket research at Peenemünde and on the scale of deportations and extermination operations. Civilian participation was essential to sustaining the underground state. Secret schools operated to preserve Polish language and culture. After German authorities banned higher education for Poles, underground newspapers circulated widely, countering Nazi propaganda and maintaining morale. Cultural and religious life continued clandestinely, providing a sense of continuity and national identity under occupation. This broad participation distinguished the Polish underground state from many other resistance movements in Europe, as it sought not only to fight militarily, but also to preserve state institutions in secret form. The presence of two occupying powers created complex conditions. In the German zone, repression was immediate and brutal, with large-scale deportations, forced labor, and the beginning of the persecution of Jews. In the Soviet zone, repression took the form of deportations to Siberia and Central Asia, collectivization, and the suppression of non-communist organizations. Both zones witnessed attempts to eliminate independent Polish structures, but both also provided fertile ground for underground organization, as repression reinforced the determination to resist. By early 1940, the underground state had established a functioning command structure. Local cells linked to regional commands coordinated intelligence, sabotage, and civil resistance. Communications with London were maintained through couriers traveling via Hungary and France, and later through clandestine radio stations. Coordination with the Polish armed forces forming abroad, in France and after 1940 in Britain and the Middle East, ensured that underground activities were integrated into the wider Allied strategy. The survival of these networks under conditions of mass arrests and executions required strict discipline. Security protocols demanded that members knew only a small number of contacts, and false documents and code names were used extensively. Despite such measures, infiltration by German and Soviet agents remained a constant threat, leading to frequent losses. Yet the resilience of the underground was evident in its continued growth. By 1941, the ZWZ had expanded into a nationwide organization, numbering tens of thousands of members. Thus, in the immediate aftermath of the September campaign, Poland's struggle did not vanish but shifted form. From a conventional army defeated in the field, it evolved into one of the most comprehensive underground resistance structures in occupied Europe. The foundation was laid for what would later become the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, the military arm of a clandestine state that sought to preserve sovereignty and prepare for liberation, even as the country remained divided between two occupying powers. By 1942, the Polish underground had become both broader and more centralized. The Union of Armed Struggle, ZWZ, formally evolved into the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, AK, which became the principal armed wing of the Polish underground state. At its peak, the AK commanded an estimated 35,000 members, though only a portion could be armed at any given time. Its mission was defined by three goals: maintaining a secret military presence, conducting sabotage and intelligence work in coordination with the Allies, and preparing for a nationwide uprising when German power weakened. The organizational model was distinctive. Unlike many partisan groups elsewhere in Europe, the AK operated as part of a clandestine state structure that mirrored official institutions. A government delegate represented the Polish government in exile within occupied Poland, overseeing civilian matters such as underground education, justice, and administration. The AK functioned as its military counterpart, with a clear chain of command ultimately subordinate to the government in exile in London. This dual structure gave the Polish resistance unusual cohesion and legitimacy in the eyes of both domestic society and the Allied powers. Sabotage and intelligence were key early activities. Railway lines, bridges, and supply depots were targeted to slow German troop movements, particularly on routes to the Eastern Front after 1941. The AK's intelligence network supplied the Allies with highly detailed reports on German operations. Among its notable contributions was information on the V-1 and V-2 rocket program at Peenemünde, which directly aided the British bombing raid on the site in August 1943. Polish agents also documented German atrocities against civilians and Jews, transmitting early reports of extermination camps such as Auschwitz to London. The German occupation regime created harsh conditions that fueled underground activity, but also imposed severe risks. In the general government, mass arrests, executions, and deportations were daily realities. German authorities deployed specialized counterintelligence units, and the Gestapo carried out frequent raids. Collective punishment policies meant that entire villages could be destroyed in response to acts of sabotage. For example, in Zamość and other regions targeted for German colonization, entire populations were expelled, with thousands killed or deported. Such measures strained the underground's ability to operate openly, but also deepened civilian support for resistance. Relations with other Polish underground formations were complex. Leftist groups such as the Gwardia Ludowa, later Armia Ludowa, affiliated with the Communist Polish Workers' Party, operated independently and often competed with the AK for recruits and resources. Nationalist and regional militias also maintained separate structures. While occasional cooperation occurred in specific operations, ideological differences, particularly concerning post-war political visions, prevented full unification. This fragmentation foreshadowed the political conflicts that would intensify as Soviet influence grew after 1944. The Jewish population under German occupation developed its own underground organizations. In Warsaw, the Jewish Combat Organization, GOB, and the Jewish Military Union, JOZLW, prepared for armed resistance in the ghetto. Although contact with the AK existed, coordination remained limited and strained by logistical and political obstacles. Nevertheless, the AK provided some weapons and training, and its reports informed the outside world of the conditions faced by Jewish communities. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943 became a symbol of armed resistance, though it was brutally suppressed by German forces. The AK also played a role in broader Allied strategy. Clandestine communications linked London to occupied Poland via courier routes through Hungary, and later by radio. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, supported Polish missions, and Polish pilots flew transport aircraft on perilous missions from Italy to deliver supplies and paratroopers into Poland. These cichociemni, silent unseen, were specially trained operatives who parachuted into occupied territory to strengthen underground capabilities. Between 1941 and 1944, 316 such operatives were deployed, many of whom assumed leadership roles in intelligence and sabotage. Despite achievements, limitations remained clear. Weapons and ammunition were scarce, as large-scale airdrops into Poland were logistically difficult given the distances involved. Many AK members remained unarmed, awaiting opportunities to acquire equipment from captured German stockpiles. The question of timing a national uprising became a constant source of debate within both the underground leadership and the government in exile. Some argued that premature action would provoke devastating reprisals, while others insisted that only a visible, nationwide rising would secure Poland's place among the Allied nations shaping the post-war settlement. By late 1943, as the Eastern Front shifted westward with the Soviet victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, the strategic context changed. The AK leadership began preparing Operation Tempest, Borza, a coordinated campaign of uprisings intended to coincide with the advance of Soviet forces into Polish territory. The goal was to demonstrate Poland's sovereignty and military contribution before the Red Army established control. This plan reflected both optimism about liberation and anxiety over Soviet intentions, since Moscow did not recognize the London-based government and supported its own Polish communist structures. The years 1942 and 1943 thus marked the consolidation of the underground into a nationwide force with broad civilian backing, significant intelligence contributions to the Allies, and increasing ambitions for open confrontation. Yet the tension between strategic patience and political urgency, coupled with the dual threat of German occupation and Soviet expansion, meant that every decision carried immense risks. The stage was set for Operation Tempest and, ultimately, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, when these contradictions would come to a head. By the beginning of 1944, the Polish underground state faced its greatest test. The Red Army's advance into former Polish territories created both opportunities and dangers for the Home Army. The plan known as Operation Tempest, Akcja Borza, was launched in January 1944, beginning in Volhynia and later expanding across much of occupied Poland. Its aim was to demonstrate Polish sovereignty by having the Home Army openly liberate towns and cities before the arrival of Soviet forces, then present themselves as the legitimate authority acting on behalf of the government in exile in London. Initial phases of the operation produced mixed results. In Volhynia, the AK's 27th Infantry Division, formed largely from underground units, mobilized around 7,000 fighters. They engaged German forces, carried out ambushes, and briefly controlled territory. When the Red Army arrived, however, Soviet commanders refused to recognize Polish authority. In some cases, AK units were disarmed, and officers were arrested by the NKVD. Similar patterns unfolded in eastern Galicia and around Lwów. Polish forces fought alongside Soviet troops to expel German garrisons, only to find themselves sidelined, disarmed, or deported soon after. Despite these difficulties, Operation Tempest expanded westward as Soviet advances continued. In Vilnius, Wilno, a major AK operation known as Operation Ostra Brama took place in July 1944. Approximately 12,000 AK fighters attacked German defenses in coordination with the Red Army. After several days of heavy combat, the city fell, but Soviet authorities again refused to accept Polish command. Many AK officers were arrested, and large numbers of soldiers were forcibly incorporated into Soviet-controlled units or deported. The political reality became clear. While Germany was being pushed back, the Soviet Union intended to establish its own dominance in Poland. In central Poland, the most dramatic and ultimately tragic manifestation of Operation Tempest was the Warsaw Uprising. Launched on 1 August 1944, it involved approximately 4,000 AK fighters, with only about half adequately armed. The uprising was timed to coincide with the Red Army's approach to the eastern bank of the Vistula. The goal was to liberate the capital before Soviet entry and establish Polish authority. Initially, insurgents seized significant portions of the city, capturing weapons and inflicting losses on German garrisons. Civilian support was substantial, with tens of thousands of residents assisting in constructing barricades, providing medical care, and maintaining underground communications. German reaction was swift and brutal. Reinforcements, including SS and police units under commanders such as Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, were deployed to crush the uprising. Systematic destruction followed, with entire districts leveled by artillery and aerial bombardment. Civilian casualties were immense. Estimates suggest over 15,000 civilians were killed during the 2 months of fighting. Despite appeals to the Allies, direct support was limited. Supply drops by British and American aircraft provided some aid, but many parachutes fell into German-held areas. The Soviet army, positioned across the river, largely refrained from intervention until the uprising had been suppressed, a decision that remains a subject of historical debate. The uprising formally ended on 2 October 1944, after 63 days of combat. Around 16,000 AK fighters were killed, with tens of thousands more captured and sent to prisoner of war camps. German forces deported much of the surviving civilian population, while systematically demolishing Warsaw. The destruction of the capital was nearly total, leaving over 80% of the city in ruins. Politically, the failure of the uprising weakened the position of the London-based government in exile and strengthened Soviet influence, as Moscow presented itself as the only viable authority capable of liberating Poland. Elsewhere in occupied Poland, Operation Tempest produced similar patterns on a smaller scale. Local uprisings briefly liberated towns such as Lublin and Rzeszów, but Soviet forces quickly assumed control. In many cases, AK fighters were given the choice of joining Soviet-backed units like the Polish People's Army, Ludowe Wojsko Polskie, or facing arrest. Thousands were detained by the NKVD, with many sent to labor camps in the Soviet Union. This created deep mistrust between Polish underground structures and the Soviet authorities, shaping post-war political divisions. Civilian society endured immense hardship throughout 1944. Reprisals by German forces escalated, particularly in regions where the AK was most active. Entire villages were destroyed, with inhabitants executed or deported to concentration camps. At the same time, the underground continued its non-military functions. Secret schools, press, and courts operated, maintaining a sense of continuity even as armed struggle reached its peak. The breadth of civilian participation in clandestine institutions reflected the resilience of Polish society despite the devastation of occupation. By the end of 1944, the dual pressures of German occupation and Soviet expansion had reshaped the Polish struggle. Militarily, the Home Army had revealed both its capacity for large-scale mobilization and the severe limitations imposed by lack of external support and political isolation. Politically, the government in exile's authority was increasingly undermined by Soviet-backed institutions, which gained ground as the Red Army advanced westward. The stage was set for the dissolution of the Home Army and the absorption of Poland into the Soviet sphere, but also for the enduring legacy of the underground state as a symbol of national continuity in the face of overwhelming external domination. In early 1945, the collapse of German forces across the Eastern Front created a radically altered landscape for Poland. As the Red Army advanced through the country, the German occupation receded, but liberation did not translate into restored sovereignty for the Polish underground state. Instead, the Soviet Union imposed its own structures of control, supported by the Polish Committee of National Liberation, a communist-dominated provisional authority established in Lublin in July 1944. This marked the beginning of a transition from dual occupation to Soviet dominance, with profound consequences for the Home Army and the wider underground network. The Home Army, exhausted by years of struggle and devastated by the losses of the Warsaw Uprising, faced a strategic impasse. Its leadership recognized that further armed confrontation with German forces was becoming redundant as the Wehrmacht retreated, yet any attempt to assert independent authority risked direct conflict with the Soviets. In January 1945, Commander-in-Chief Leopold Okulicki, codenamed Niedźwiadek, issued the formal order to disband the Home Army. At its height, the organization had involved up to 35,000 members, though by 1945, only a fraction remained operational. Disbandment was intended to protect fighters from mass arrests and to prevent civil war against the Soviets, but it also left veterans vulnerable to persecution without the protection of an organized command. The NKVD and Soviet-backed Polish security services systematically targeted former AK members. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, and deported to gulags in the Soviet Union. Key figures were invited to supposed negotiations, only to be detained. In March 1945, 16 leaders of the Polish underground state, including Jan Stanisław Jankowski, the government delegate, and General Okulicki himself, were arrested by Soviet authorities and taken to Moscow. They were later subjected to the Trial of the 16 in June 1945, where they were sentenced on charges of sabotage and collaboration with Germany. The trial underscored the Soviet determination to dismantle the underground structures and delegitimize the London-based government in exile. Meanwhile, the physical devastation of the country remained immense. Warsaw, destroyed during and after the uprising, was nearly uninhabitable. Major cities across Poland suffered severe damage. Industrial output had collapsed, and agricultural production was disrupted by both scorched earth tactics and the displacement of millions. Civilian casualties throughout the war are estimated at nearly 6 million, including approximately 3 million Polish Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. The demographic and social fabric of the country was irreversibly altered. Despite the formal dissolution of the Home Army, elements of the resistance continued in new forms. Various groups, often labeled as the Cursed Soldiers, Żołnierze Wyklęci, refused to accept Soviet domination and engaged in armed insurgency against communist authorities into the late 1940s. These groups operated in forests and rural regions, conducting raids on security offices, prisons, and transportation lines. Their numbers are estimated at around 15,000 to 30,000 at their peak, though they lacked unified command and were gradually overwhelmed by superior Soviet and Polish communist forces. The broader population faced a new wave of political realignment. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 confirmed that Poland would fall within the Soviet sphere of influence, despite formal pledges of free elections and democratic governance. In practice, the emerging Polish People's Republic was constructed under Moscow's supervision, with the Communist Polish Workers' Party consolidating power and suppressing opposition. For many Poles who had supported the underground, this outcome represented the replacement of one occupation with another, though officially presented as liberation. The exile government in London, led after 1943 by Prime Minister Stanisław Mikołajczyk, attempted to maintain international recognition and influence. While Western governments formally continued to recognize it until mid-1945, Practical power rested with the authorities installed in Warsaw under Soviet protection. Mikołajczyk returned to Poland briefly in an effort to negotiate political participation, but opposition parties were marginalized, and fraudulent elections in 1947 consolidated communist rule. The structures of the underground state, once the largest and most sophisticated resistance network in occupied Europe, were dismantled by a combination of repression, political isolation, and the shifting balance of power among the Allies. For civilians, the post-war years were marked by both relief at the end of German terror and fear of Soviet-imposed controls. New deportations, land reforms, and purges reshaped the social landscape. Former underground activists faced a stark choice between adaptation to the new system or continued resistance with little hope of success. Many who had risked their lives under German occupation now found themselves imprisoned or executed under Soviet-backed courts. By mid-1945, Poland's wartime trajectory had come full circle. The nation that had first fallen victim to German and Soviet invasion in September 1939 had fought for 6 years through clandestine statehood, sabotage, and armed uprisings, only to emerge under another imposed regime. Yet, even in defeat, the memory and structures of the underground state endured, preserved by veterans, émigrés, and the broader society that had sustained them. This memory would become central to post-war identity and debates about sovereignty, resistance, and the meaning of independence in a world reshaped by great power politics. The legacy of the Polish underground state and the Home Army extended far beyond the military defeat and political repression that followed the end of the Second World War. From 1939 to 1945, Poland experienced occupation by 2 totalitarian powers, catastrophic losses, and destruction on a scale unmatched in much of Europe. Yet within those years, the underground built institutions that preserved the continuity of the Polish nation, even in the absence of sovereignty. This achievement distinguished Poland's wartime experience, shaping both historical debates and national memory long after the conflict ended. In terms of scale, the underground state was unique. At its height, it included not only the Home Army as a military force, but also clandestine courts, schools, administrative offices, and cultural organizations. Underground universities continued higher education for thousands of students, while secret publishing produced newspapers, textbooks, and literature banned by the occupiers. The judiciary system conducted trials against collaborators, enforcing sentences ranging from fines to capital punishment. These structures reflected an effort not merely to resist occupation, but to maintain the existence of a functioning state in exile within its own borders. No other occupied country developed such a comprehensive clandestine government. The Home Army's contributions to the Allied war effort were considerable. Intelligence on German military operations, industrial production, and advanced weapons programs proved vital to British and American planning. Reports on the V-1 and V-2 rocket facilities, the movements of German divisions to the Eastern Front, and early documentation of the Holocaust highlighted the scope of Polish intelligence work. These achievements ensured that, despite its geographic isolation, Poland remained an active participant in the global struggle against the Axis. The Warsaw Uprising, though a military failure, became one of the defining symbols of the Polish wartime experience. Its destruction underscored the limitations of resistance without sustained external support, but it also revealed the determination of a population to assert sovereignty even under the most unfavorable conditions. The uprising entered historical memory as both a tragedy and a testament to endurance, generating debates about timing, Allied responses, and Soviet intentions. In the decades that followed, it became a focal point of commemoration and a contested symbol in political discourse, especially under communist rule, when official narratives minimized the role of the Home Army. After 1945, the fate of former underground members reflected the contradictions of liberation. Thousands were persecuted, imprisoned, or executed by Soviet-backed authorities, while others went into exile in Western Europe, North America, and elsewhere. The London-based government in exile, though gradually losing diplomatic recognition, preserved continuity with the pre-war republic until 1990. veterans organizations abroad documented the activities of the underground, keeping alive the memory of a state that had functioned without territory. Within Poland, remembrance was constrained by censorship, but clandestine publications and oral traditions sustained knowledge across generations. The losses sustained by Poland during the war were immense. Estimates suggest nearly 6 million Polish citizens died, including approximately 3 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust. Infrastructure, industry, and cultural heritage were devastated. Warsaw, rebuilt after 1945, became a symbol not only of destruction, but also of resilience. The memory of clandestine statehood and armed struggle became intertwined with the broader narrative of national suffering and recovery. In historical scholarship, the Polish underground state is often analyzed as a phenomenon that blurred the line between resistance and governance. Unlike partisan warfare alone, it sought to represent the continuity of the Polish Republic within an occupied land. Its integration with the government in exile created a duality of statehood, one visible abroad, the other hidden at home. This duality ensured that, despite occupation, Poland never legally ceased to exist in the eyes of its citizens and allies. The legacy of these years continued into the Cold War and beyond. For communist authorities, the underground state and the Home Army were politically inconvenient reminders of an alternative vision of Poland aligned with the West. Official narratives emphasized communist partisans, while marginalizing or condemning AK veterans. Yet, in private memory and émigré communities, the underground remained central to identity. After 1989, with the fall of communism, recognition of the underground state was restored, veterans were honored, and research expanded to explore its complexities with fewer restrictions. Today, the story of Poland as the first victim of the Second World War is inseparable from the narrative of resistance that followed. The underground embodied both the costs and the resilience of maintaining sovereignty under occupation. It revealed the contradictions of Allied strategy, the brutality of dual occupation, and the determination of a society to preserve continuity despite overwhelming force. Its history is not only a record of military operations, but also of cultural survival, political legitimacy, and the dilemmas of resistance in a world dominated by great powers. In this sense, the Polish underground state remains one of the most significant examples of clandestine resistance in modern history. Its institutions provided a framework for national survival under unprecedented conditions, while its memory continues to shape debates about independence, sovereignty, and the costs of freedom. The wartime experiences of Poland, beginning with the September Campaign, extending through the rise of the underground, and culminating in the Warsaw Uprising, form a narrative of persistence amid devastation, leaving a legacy that endures as part of the broader history of 20th century Europe.